Good morning. We're looking at Esther chapter 7, verses 5 through 8. And if, again, you're not familiar with this book, Esther, who is a Jew, is pleading to the king for the redemption of her people who have been sold out by a man named Haman, who wants to have them all put to death. And she's making her appeal to the king, and the story kind of comes to a climax here in chapter 7. And we'll just read some of these verses now. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who would dare to presume in his heart to do such a thing?" Referring to killing the Jewish people. And Esther said, "The adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" And as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. What I wanted to point out was just a thought that occurred to me. If you remember back in chapter 1, how this whole story began, it began when the king was having a party for 7 days with many of his nobles, and they were drinking, and the king was pretty drunk, and he calls for the queen to be brought in and paraded before all his nobles to show her beauty. And the queen says that she won't come. The king gets very angry. He asks his counselors what he should do. They tell him that they should banish that queen and pick another queen in her place. And chapter 2 begins with the king saying that he regretted the decision. He missed that Queen Vashti. And I commented then about the ability to, one, not have our senses dulled by wine. If we're never going to make good decisions being drunk, and the Bible warns us against drunkenness. But two, understanding how our emotions affect us, and when we're angry, not to make snap decisions, because we usually regret the decisions we made when we're just prompted by anger. And we looked at a scripture, and I'll show it to you again, in the book of Proverbs, that says, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." So being slow to anger, having that personal control of your emotions, is something that we should really desire, and it's something that's really hard to do, and we need to ask God's help in doing this. But when we can master ourselves, you've learned a great and invaluable trait. Well, maybe we see a little bit of that being developed in the king here, because it says in verse 7 that the king arose from his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. He gets up while he's angry. He's been drinking a little bit because it's a banquet of wine, and he walks out and he goes into the garden to clear his head before he makes a snap decision. Haman was a trusted prince in his kingdom. There was an accusation made against him. He was really angry, but he didn't want to make that snap judgment again. And he comes back in, and Haman just made it worse because he's now on the couch where the queen is, and it goes really bad for Haman at this point. But maybe there was a little growth in the king. Maybe he was remembering, the last time I made a decision in anger, it wasn't my best decision. And what I want us to remember today is not only do we want to avoid making decisions when we're angry, but as we're trying to develop these good character traits, godly character traits, as we're praying for the Lord to conform us unto the image of Jesus, we'll encounter situations, and sometimes we don't fare well in those situations. Sometimes we fail and we fall short of what we desired to do or really knew what God would want us to do. And we implore God about that, and we ask for his forgiveness. And normally, and I know it's been this way in my own life, that's not the only time we'll probably encounter that temptation again. That probably sometime, and usually sooner rather than later, we're put in a situation that's fairly similar. And God allows us these second chances so that we could learn to grow. Just like you don't master something the first time you try it. You don't, when the first time you're riding a bike, you don't do it perfectly. You have to do it a few times until you develop the skill, and then you can master it. In the same way, learning to master our emotions, learning to trust God, is a progressive event in our life. And we get to these chances to do it over and over again. And hopefully, each time we fail, we're learning something from it. And we're coming to God. And we're going to be more determined to practice what he says. And maybe, just maybe, in these verses, we see that that's what the king was doing. If it wasn't, it's still something that we should consider for ourselves. So the next time we're tempted, remember first what God said before you act out on your own. Have a great day, guys. Bye.